Good morning and welcome to Chapter 7, Episode 8 of the story. This chapter is titled The Grandparents. It's a really good one. So, everyone has grandparents. We all do. Most of us. And whether we know them or not, we have grandparents. And in a lot of cases, they play a really important role in our lives. Sometimes not, but for the most part, they sure do. So for me, my sets of grandparents, their roles were kind of varied. My dad's grandma, my great-grandma, as well as my dad's parents were absolutely paramount in my life. And I don't know where I would be without them. My mom's parents were great, but to this day, I really don't know them all that well. We called them Grandma and Grandpa. So growing up, if we said Grandma or Grandpa, that's who we were referring to. Growing up during my childhood, they lived in Kodiak, Alaska, which is where my mom was raised. And so we just didn't see them very often. But they would come down and visit the lower 48 every so often. And whenever they were here, we really enjoyed them. I have fun memories with them. Very simple people, and they were always so easily entertained by some of the just what we thought were the funniest things. They seemed to think that it was really cool or fascinating, and it's probably because they lived on an island in Alaska and they didn't see a lot up there. They used to kind of ooh and ah, and really, it was all the time at just the most random things. I remember this one time that my grandpa, bless his heart, was just marveling over the air conditioner in the car and how cold it got and how strong it blew. And he was just fascinated by it. And, in his defense, they probably weren't blasting the AC up in Alaska all that much, but it was just the simple things. I really remember them being just, really fun, down-to-earth, simple people. My grandpa was always just, jolly. Seriously. He was so upbeat about everything, and he had this energy that he walked into a room and everyone kind of lit up. He was just always so full of positivity. My grandma, however, she didn't smile very much, actually. And she was kind of always skeptical about things. She was actually famous for saying the words, "Shame on you," whenever we did something wrong or, I don't know, made mom upset growing up. Kind of interesting. Shame on you. But regardless, she was very sweet in her own way as well. I know that we visited Kodiak, Alaska, where they lived once when I was 3 or 4 years old, but I don't remember it. And besides that, I only have kind of this one memory of staying with them that I can recall. It was when I was about 14, and it actually wasn't even them. It was just my grandma. I actually stayed the night at her house in Spokane, and the next day she took me and helped me get the newest Harry Potter book. I was just visiting the area, but it was just one night, and to this day, that's the only night that I can recall staying with them. So sadly, I just don't have many memories of them, and I never really got the opportunity to get to know them very well. They actually even ended up living in the same city as me for a while, but I don't know. We just didn't get together all that much. So they're wonderful people, and they're still around, and they just kind of do their own thing. Grandpa is still really jolly and upbeat, and Grandma's still kind of a grouch, but in her own sweet way. You just have to know her. As for the grandparents that were much more a part of my life growing up, I want to start with my great-grandma. So Billy Marthel Davidson, Whitehurst Davidson, was just as unique as her name, Billy Marthel. And as you might guess, that's a very southern name. I know there's a whole debate about whether or not Oklahoma is the South. I know that technically it's not, but they've got a lot of, Southern influences. So she was born and raised in Kiowa, Oklahoma. And in 1924, she was the daughter of a military guy and a very strong-willed woman. I've heard crazy good, amazing, inspiring stories about my great-great-grandmother. So her daddy was killed in the war, unfortunately, and so she assisted in raising her two younger siblings. She was the eldest, and she actually helped her mom kind of run this local cafe service station there in Kiowa. And through a whole series of crazy events, she got married, things like that. She ended up on the West Coast, in the Wild West, and she lived a pretty extraordinary life. So she had two children, one of them being my grandma, and she was a fabulous mom to them, but she was also a career girl, and I love this about my great-grandma. So Grandma B, because her name was Billy, we called her Grandma B, and her sister Jean actually both worked their way up, like really high up, at GE in the nuclear division in San Francisco. And this was at a time when women were not, they didn't have careers like that. So my grandma worked in accounting and her sister worked in human resources. And they were both just brilliant women. And I love that that's a part of their story. Unfortunately, Grandma B's husband passed away unexpectedly, my grandma's dad. And so she was by herself for quite some time. But she did marry again. And she married this guy named Glenn. Grandpa Glenn is how I knew him. And he was the great-grandpa that I knew, and he actually passed away when I was 10 from lung cancer. So that makes her a widow twice now. She was twice widowed. And she had, plenty of time. She'd done very well financially, so she didn't live an extravagant life, but she was comfortable. And so she just kind of had a lot of time to devote to her hobbies and her family, and especially one of her great-grandsons, me. So we lived in the same town. She ended up moving to Central Oregon. I'm not even sure when, but that's where she wound up. And starting at about age 8 or 9, maybe 9 or 10, I actually started staying the night with my Grandma B every Tuesday and Thursday because she lived in town. So, after school activities were typically out of the question for us because one, they were fairly expensive and we didn't have a ton of money. And two, we lived in the middle of nowhere. So it was totally impractical to think that we could, go to a practice or a piano lesson or whatever it was and then just get a ride home or be picked up from home. It just, the commute didn't work out at all. But she lived in town. And she actually had this darling little Baldwin spinet piano. And I started playing on that thing probably when I was 3 or 4. And I had gotten pretty good at it. And so in addition to boy choir, which is the reason that I was, there every Tuesday and Thursday because it was in town, she actually started paying for and taking me to piano lessons. So she became a really integral part of my growing up. So boy choir was every Tuesday and Thursday, and piano lessons were on Thursday before boy choir. And I just have the fondest memories of it just being her and me. We formed a very, very special bond. So her driver's license probably should have been taken away long before I ever came around. But she was still driving, and so she would say to me, I'm going to meet you after school. I'll meet you at the stop sign. I'm like, oh, God, okay. So she would come pick me up at school, and she would just, stop at the stop sign. Just stop there. She didn't pull over. She didn't park, nothing. And there would be a line of cars completely down the street. And so I knew that the moment the bell rang, I just needed to race outside to get to her as fast as I could because people were honking their horns and waiting for her to move, and I would be so embarrassed. I didn't want to slip into that car, but whatever. She picked me up from school. And when I got home to her house, she always had dinner ready. So it's 3:45, 4 p.m., and she would have dinner ready. And it was always kind of this, I don't know, strange sort of pieced together meal. We'd have like, she'd have gone to McDonald's earlier that day and bought hamburgers and kept them cold and then reheated them for dinner kind of thing. Or she'd have like a big pot of parsnips. And we're like, okay, that's what we're having for dinner. And whenever I was done with boy choir, she'd pick me up. I mean, she like was trucking me around a lot. So like one of my dear sweet friends, you know, this was Grandma B. And we loved when we got home and it was nighttime. There really wasn't a bedtime, but so it'd be the evening and we would watch old movies. A lot of Turner Classic movies, all the Rodgers and Hammersteins, just lots of old movies. And, but when she fell asleep, I very often changed the channel to Disney Channel or Nickelodeon. She had like full programming at her house and we did not have that at ours. So kind of fun. She took care of me when I needed it the most. You know, there's a lot going on at home, which you've heard in chapters like the mom and the dad and the childhood. And going to Grandma B's was just sort of this respite. It was just this little paradise for me. And we would just talk and talk and talk and talk. And I loved hearing stories from her earlier days, from her as a kid, she was a magical person. And she unfortunately died when I was 14. And random memory, my voice used to be really high. And I know that's kind of a high voice now. But I actually sing bass too, if you can even believe that. But I remember that when my voice was changing, the last time I ever sang alto in like full voice was actually at her funeral. I very specifically remember that. So she passed away. But her daughter was still around to look after me. So Grandma B's daughter, or Nana, as we've always called her, was a 1 in a million kind of a gal. And partly because, because of who she was, but also because of who she married. And that would be my papa, Joe. So Nana and Papa were just such special people. They were the kind of people that knew everybody. And they had hundreds of friends. And they would do anything for anyone. Almost to like, we'd be like, you can't keep helping them out. They'd be like, oh, whatever. It's our money. It's our resources. We are going to do what we want. I mean, they helped everyone out all the time. As I mentioned in the dad chapter, so Nana is my dad's mom. And she had 3 boys consecutively, like 3, 2, 1. And so crazy kind of growing up years. And she loved those boys more than anything in her whole entire life. Unfortunately, both Nana and Papa were plagued with a lot of health issues their entire lives. And I know that had a lot to do with things that had happened, early on in their lives. I know that my grandma, Nana, she had appendicitis that was untreated until she was like her body was septic and it was awful. And it kind of created this entire string of health issues for her. And I know that my grandpa, early on in his life, got struck by lightning and fell off a barn. And oh my word, he was just riddled with problems because of that. So, and I know that affected the boys a lot growing up. They were probably a little more independent than the average kids because they just, their parents were sick. So if they wanted to make something happen, they were going to need to do it themselves. Regardless, Nana and Papa were loving, loving parents. And they were just the sweetest, kindest people. So for my entire life that I knew them, they had been on disability because of these health issues that they'd had earlier on in their lives. So, they weren't necessarily going to work all the time. Their primary focus was their health. They wanted to, they're always going to doctor's appointments and what can we do to get better? But also, amongst other things, their family. Just family was so, so important. The nephews, the nieces, the cousins, the grandkids, the sons. It was just like, that meant everything to them. But before they became disabled, they did have some really fun careers. So my papa actually, I mean, he was a Renaissance man. I'm going to refer to that several times in this episode, but he did things like he owned an excavation company, like the big backhoes and dump trucks and all that. He's done that, did all the road paving and everything that goes along with that. He was a locksmith, and he owned a local company called Bend Lock and Key. He started it. He was a wizard at breaking safes, of all things. He loved keys and locks, and he became so great at it that he was just an expert statewide, region-wide, really. People would come to him with all kinds of requests. And he also, one of my favorite things, he owned a pet store. I mean, he just kind of did it all. There was never a barrier or an obstacle that would stop him from just trying, something. He did a lot, and I love that about him. And again, he was a Renaissance man, and anyone who knew him would tell you that. He could do anything. He could garden, he could paint, he could work on any plumbing, electrical, he could build a house. He knew everything about plants and agriculture, and but what he knew most about, probably more than anything else, was cars. He was a talented, sought-after car restorationist. And, oh my goodness, the cars. They kind of took over our life in a way, but they were beautiful, old cars, and he would just restore them to absolute perfection. So he did a lot. And in his later years, it was the cars that kept him going. I say he was retired because technically he wasn't getting a paycheck. But his job was cars. He was up at that shop every single day, and he taught me so much about just cars. I know my family probably doesn't believe that today, but I did pay attention, and it was all because of my papa. Nana, though, had also enjoyed several careers before she wasn't able to work anymore. She had been a nurse. She had a great sense of fashion, and she actually worked as a fashion merchandiser at the Bon Marché for a long time. And she was very musical, very upbeat, very funny, and it made her a total extrovert. And she was a perfect candidate to write jingles for a local radio station. So she was in advertising for this radio station, and she would write the jingle, perform the jingle, and it's just fun. I've heard a couple actually that I found. So they were just, despite their health struggles, they just always put other people first. Always. Everybody that walked through their door was instantly made to feel like their family. You're home. Here you are. What do you need? I remember our Thanksgivings and Christmases would just have dozens of people that I didn't even know. I remember one time we had a Thanksgiving that was legitimately 50 people big, and I didn't know half of them. But that was just who they were. They would cook so much food, it was almost pathetic, and leftovers for weeks. But everyone was fed, everyone was taken care of, and everyone knew that they could go there if they needed a place to be. I actually lived with Nana and Papa, starting at about the age of 16. We were there a lot during my childhood, like a lot, many times a week. But I ended up living there for a variety of reasons, and we became even closer during that time. Unfortunately, my grandpa was really sick. He had COPD and emphysema. And I don't know if you've ever experienced someone going through that, but it's tragic. And it lasted several years. And so, it was hard to watch him suffer through that. But I was able to help in a lot of ways because I lived there. And Grandma wasn't totally capable of, just taking care of him, but she did her best as well. So we became really close when I lived there. At the very end of his life, though, they gave him all kinds of drugs to try and cope with the pain and suffering that he was experiencing. And it really sort of altered his personality a bit, and he became easily agitated. The smallest thing would kind of set him off. And so some of our last memories with Grandpa, he wasn't the Papa that we had always known. But you know what? Until the very end, the number one most important thing for him was family. And we all knew that. And he passed away when I was 22. And there were so many people at his funeral, people that he had touched and inspired and encouraged and motivated. It was just a beautiful, beautiful thing to witness, because we always knew he had made such a mark on the world, but just to see it tangibly with people coming out was really special. And he was a fantastic painter, as I've mentioned, and I have several of his pieces, in fact, and I think about him all the time. And I just wonder, how did this person, my papa, become so talented at everything? He was talented at everything, a true Renaissance man. And he still inspires me all the time. I think about him every day. And I think about Nana every day, too. Ever since I was a little boy, Nana was my most favorite person in the world. I don't know where that special bond came from, because I know she loved other people and so did I, but she was my person. She loved life. She just loved that she was alive. She was grateful for it, because there was a lot of times where she should have left this earth. And she was full of joy and happiness, and she laughed all the time. One of our favorite things to do together was to watch movies. New movies, old movies, just funny movies in general. Our very favorite, probably, and I'm sure my siblings will echo this, was Mrs. Doubtfire. And we would we would watch it all the time, repeatedly. And she would laugh so hard, she would, start, excuse me, she would just get out of breath, and she would actually, her teeth would fall right out into her lap. She was always laughing, and she loved to laugh. It was one of her favorite things to do. She also loved Weekend at Bernie's, was one of her favorite movies. And our favorite movie, not a laughing one, but just we'd cry and laugh and experience everything, was Fried Green Tomatoes. One of my favorites to this day. She wore muumuus all the time. That fat sense of fashion, I think she did away with that when she left her job at the Bon Marché. It stayed there. It's not like she looked bad, and she could still put herself together really well for like church and different functions, but she wore muumuus when she was at home, and they were really bright colors, lots of fun patterns. We loved her muumuus. We used to have tea parties, cereal parties, breakfast parties. She made everything, whether we were eating or drinking, into a party. And we'd go out on the porch in the sun if it was, nice out, or we'd just stay inside, and we would all wear big hats and dress up. She loved it, and she found any excuse that she could to sort of get out the feather boas and the hats. Just one of her favorite things. And she was, that's just kind of her in a nutshell. She was so easily satisfied and content. I strive for that all the time. You should have seen the look on her face when you presented her with a plate of like perfectly cooked scrambled eggs, because there was nothing better in the world than that to her. She was so just simple and just down to earth, and knew what true pure joy was. At the same time that she demonstrated and exhibited all of this pure joy, interestingly enough, my grandma actually suffered from bipolar disorder almost her entire life. And she had been on lithium for over 60 years to help control it. Most people had no idea whatsoever that she struggled with bipolar disorder. For the overwhelming majority of the time, she was completely fine. People had no idea. And on the rare occasion that she would kind of slip into a manic episode or whatnot, or even a depressive episode, we would just did you have your pill? And she'd almost always say no. And the moment you gave her her pill, she just bounced right back. She was completely fine. She was like the textbook patient that any physician would prescribe lithium to, because it worked wonders for her. You'd never even guess that she had it. But there were a couple of times growing up when We knew she had it. But again, just give her a pill and she was fine. Besides that, she was so insightful and so wise. She spent a lot of time in the hospital during her life and in nursing homes and in rehab centers. And I think just she was observing all the time. And I think that just lent to her wisdom. And also just the love that she exuded. She was so loving. Everybody knew that you could tell Nana absolutely anything and you would never be judged or criticized for it. Like, you just wouldn't. She and I talked about everything all the time. I mean, there was not a thing in the world that I did not talk to my Nana about. And I remember that when I told her I was gay, she just kind of looked at me. She got kind of big eyes. She had the prettiest blue eyes, y'all. Just bright blue eyes. And she had that, some people can do it, like they can make their eyes really wide. I cannot do it. But she could. She got really big eyes, and then she kind of lowered them. And she just said, oh, whatever. If you're gay, that's okay. I love you. And that was just her. Anything you told her, there was never any judgment, and she would just make it seem so workable and livable and simple. Like, okay, great. What's next? She was just my person. She was that person for me my entire life. When anything bad, good, exciting, depressing, it didn't even matter. You name it. When it happened, she was my first call that I made. It was to her. So going back to the lithium for a second, unfortunately, while lithium is still considered to this day one of the most effective courses of treatment for someone with bipolar disorder, it also has a lot of side effects that are not pretty, including the fact that it wrecks your kidneys. So towards the end of her life, her chemical imbalances were so crazy that she, because of dysfunctional kidney function, because of the lithium, she got kind of out of her head. She didn't know what was going on. She was confused. The nurses and all the staff would try so hard to take care of her, and her body was just not having it. It was shutting down. And I'll never forget the last time that I was able to talk to her. I wasn't actually there. But my sister, she was surrounded by so many people that loved her, all three of her boys and a lot of the grandkids. My sister held the phone up to her ear, and I just got this moment of clarity, and I know that she heard me. She wasn't talking at the time. She wasn't verbal, but I just said thank you so much for making me the person that I am today, and for everything that she taught me. And, I let her know that she did her job and she could go. And I'm not saying it was specifically me saying that. I think a lot of people were saying that to her. But within like 2 hours of me being able to say my goodbye, she was gone. She was just gone. Losing people you love is never easy. Ever. And especially when they are really special, like your grandparents. Like I get choked up just talking about it. I wish all the time that they were still here so that I could talk to them, ask them the question, just listen to their stories and their wisdom and their advice. I have no idea where I would be today if it hadn't have been for my grandparents, especially my Nana. No idea whatsoever. She was the guardian angel that was sent here to take care of me. She was my person. Oh, the tears. And the older souls in our lives in general are just so full of wisdom and advice. And one of my hopes and intents of this chapter is to remind everyone of just how special that is, especially the wisdom that comes from your grandparents. I don't quote the Bible very much, hardly ever, But I will say that one of my favorite verses is in Proverbs 16:16. And it just says, how much better is wisdom than gold? And I think it's 1000% true. Without so much of the wisdom that my grandparents gave me, especially Nana, I would not be here today. And not that I'm dripping in gold, that would be kind of nice, or anything like that, but I wouldn't be here as a person, you know? I remember their words so often. One of Nana's most famous lines, if you came to her with something, especially about somebody, she would just say, oh, maybe they're just, but you don't have to be. So if I was coming in like, oh, they're mad at me, she'd be like, oh, maybe they're just mad because whatever, but you don't have to be. And she'd always follow it up with, so let's just move on, because you've got stuff to do. I wonder where I got just keep digging from. Cherish your grandparents if they're still around, and ask them all the questions. Let them give you all the loves, all the wisdom, all the advice. I promise it's invaluable. And also, be sure and write down your grandma's favorite cookie recipe before she's gone, because I assure you that nobody makes them quite like she does. I promise you'll thank me. That is my chapter about the grandparents. So many more things I could say, but thank you all so much for watching. And again, I'm doing 2 episodes per week now. I'm speeding this along. Got a lot to say. So have a fabulous rest of your Thursday, and I will see you next week.